Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of First Person Mapper. Catfood and I are here to sit down with the Black Mesa developers, some of the Black Mesa developers, I should say, because it was quite a big team. We've got Shawn Olson, technical artist and pipeline man. He's in your upper right-hand corner. Right below that is Chon Kemp, who is the lead level designer for Black Mesa, and below him is Matt in 3D, also known as Matt Young. He's here to talk about some of the environmental artist work that he did, and as well as play some rocks, I'm sure, in the background while
many rocks.
Many rocks. So, my first question for you guys is, obviously the definitive edition came out pretty recently, and this has the whole project has been, I think, something like 8 years in the making almost. So we're going to have some questions from the 1.0 crowd and the questions for the 1.5 crowd. But the first thing that I wanted to ask, if Shawn, if you could give us some sort of overview, I suppose, of how the project has changed since the previous version that had come out, the previous major version with the whole Zen debut. What can people who are looking to come back into Black Mesa, who've already maybe played that, what can they expect to be different now that we've got a new version sort of out there for the world to see?
It's better. I think Matt would be better for answering that one, and Shawn. Matt is
there's a hybrid of both, that we could cover. So Chon, if you want to talk about the design aspects that we went over and the passes we made, I can cover the art stuff if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, so the team changed a lot over the development of Zen, and as Zen was, we mostly treated it as a entirely original piece of content, of course, with the Half-Life framework and the original Zen framework. But we did a lot of original design work for it, and over the course of doing that, we developed our design sensibilities, and we got what I would think pretty good at Half-Life style design. And so when we'd released Zen with what we called the 0.9 update, we then realized that there were a lot of parts of Earthbound that really were kind of not following the kinds of design principles that we'd come to understand as we were developing Zen. So we then thought we would go back and revisit those parts of Earthbound and really just clean up a lot of the bits of where the design maybe wasn't quite up to par, either in Half-Life 1 or in our own interpretation of parts of Half-Life 1 where it just didn't quite sync up. So we did a lot of work to improve the combat spaces so that players would utilize them better and the combat would be more fun and dynamic. We also did a lot of changes to puzzles so that there was a better understanding of player cause and effect, a lot more player agency. And then on the other front, we also did a lot of art improvements to try and bring the art level up to par with Zen, which I think is something Matt could probably talk a bit more about.
And building off of that, I mean, we did, it's been a long journey, where we started in the mod. Rather, I've only been on the team for about 3 years. So the mod version that had come out, there's a lot of technical limitations in the past that have been removed since, with our access to the source engine and the improvements that we made, such as, even the basic displacement limit being raised and, other things like we have our new volumetric lighting system with it's a custom CSM implementation. It's not using CSGO as lighting engine. Like, we put in probably a couple of years. Chetan was our graphics programmer. He did an amazing job with implementing all these new features still on the DirectX 9 version. So it's quite an accomplishment that he figured out. And so as that process was coming along, we were making discoveries for what was actually possible with our new technology and what we could do and push the boundaries for that. So Zen was kind of like the ultimate form of that. And once we had established what we knew what was possible, we kind of took that knowledge and applied it back to the older sections of the game, such as the surface tension cliff sections was just like, I think back in the day, Chon, it was pushing the ceiling for displacement limits and there wasn't much you could do. But I had the fortunate resource expansion that I could go absolutely crazy and really push it to the limit. And I think we're pretty happy with how that came out. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I could add to that, that is also where Shawn and Woolworm came into it, because all of these art expansions would absolutely not have been possible without Woolworm and without our pipeline of taking things into Woolworm, arting them in Woolworm, pulling them back into Hammer, and then doing level design adjustments further to that in Hammer. And again, that was all not possible even just 10 years ago.
Absolutely,
these tools didn't exist.
Yeah, I would actually extend that. Like, my sort of first proper question about the technical side of things is, it's just a notorious, especially when I talk to CSGO mappers, they have a lot of complaints about the workspace that they're working within. And it sounds like, as much of a joy as it is to level design or potentially even art, depending on what their passions are, there's a lot of limitations within the engine itself that just because of the workspace and the situation that it's in doesn't feel as joyous as it could be, realistically speaking. You almost have to sit back afterwards, right?
You're gonna say although like everyone that's like every level designer that's creating maps for CSGO.
Yes.
He has it easier than these guys had it, right? Because we have like more upgrades. Because a lot of features you guys didn't have, right? That you nowadays have, like a CS:GO maps. Like a lot of features you or like maybe you had to like implement them yourself because you couldn't get like the updates from. That's also kind of weird because it's the same engine. You would say you can like copy some features from the CS:GO updates to the older version of Source because it's basically still Source.
Yeah. So when we brought the game to the Steam in 2015, we had to decide which version of the Source engine to port to from the mod 2007 version, and the CS:GO engine was actually one that we attempted to port the game to. And I wasn't fully around myself either at that time either, but it broke the game in a lot of horrendous ways. So we ended up actually settling on the Source 2013 version, which the game is on today. And it was a real shame because it was somewhat after we'd released the game on Steam that Valve really started adding loads and loads of new cool features to the CS:GO engine. Yeah. Like I think you've got all that ambient lighting and stuff like that. And
I'm jealous of the BSP font you guys have and all that.
Yeah, also this, yeah. I'm also trying and scaling models. Yeah, of course you could maybe also do this or no?
We have model scaling, but it's the really inconvenient version where you have to fire IO at it and you can't actually see it in the editor.
Yes. Fucking yeah. That's really annoying. Yeah.
Basically not usable.
Yeah, you can see it in the editor, but it just depends on which editor you're using, Chon. Remember that.
Oh yeah. Okay. Here we go. The 3MX.
I always have to tease Chon about this stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah.
It's a good point to bring up the scaling because in terms of that environment angle, when you're doing compositions for scenes, and I had a lot of experience, doing set dressing and Hammer and even working with it. I got very efficient, but ultimately when it comes down to you can't scale your objects, like you can't establish any primary and secondary and tertiary shapes for your rocks. And so it just kind of looks like this noisy mess. And that can be, I did end up compiling like hundreds of variants of scalable like rocks that the level designers could play around with. But like the ability to interact with, your rocks in 3ds Max and scale them to the precise angles and being able to rotate them in ways that Hammer couldn't even begin to imagine. It's definitely opened up the possibilities for what you can create. So
yeah, and of course you can also because we also talked about this we had like a stream earlier, how long ago was this? Like 2 weeks?
It was about 2 weeks ago.
Yeah,
we were also talking about that you can if you do this if you make the level in 3D Max, you can compile multiple models at the same time. So you can also make smaller deformations to each model, and it's still the same rock, right? But you also can do this in Hammer. So that's also why 3D Max is really useful for detailing and stuff like this. Because the guys that made Anubis, they didn't use 3D Max. So they had I think they had 2 rocks or 3 rocks, and they used it for the entire level.
Yeah. And another point is that Max enabled clustering of our assets. So each individual rock in the scene, there's no way that could be a single static mesh for each of them, because I think at that point our try count was getting to over 3 million polys per scene at minimum. And so and what Wallworm enabled us to do is these awesome clustering tools that we had. We could take all of our rocks and Boolean operand them together in a union, and then we could optimize from there. And it really cut down on draw calls, and that's where our performance improvements at least began. There's a lot of other things going on, but that made it even possible to begin with to start, putting that many objects in the scene. So it's quite a drastic difference.
Yeah, it's the same for me. If I didn't use Wallworm in 3D Max, I'm not sure if I would be still making maps, because it's it's again a super big compliment to you, Shawn. Yeah, Shawn. Sorry, Shawn Olson, of course, but yeah.
I have had people compare our work to Dear Esser, and I think that's just totally unfair, because I've seen Robert Briscoe work in Hammer with the brush tools for pushing the displacements around, and the stuff that he was able to pull off in that tech was just miles more impressive. That's not to say that Shawn's tools aren't phenomenal. They definitely sped up our work. We saved. I can remember scenes taking a couple weeks to finish, but by the end of it, I could get a level done in a couple days. It's ready to ship, and it was getting to that point because we got down to the wire on some of the scenes. So the tools actually, they really did save us.
Yeah, one of the things I'm mostly curious about is what I'm sort of getting at is not only did you level up your own personal, I guess we could call it developer sensibilities. I think that's the word that you used, Chon. So like it
Yep.
sounds like not only did you guys get better at creating levels or just being level designers or environment artists or game developers more broadly speaking, but on a lower level as well, it's like your process was able to be leveled up just by virtue of having access to better tech the longer the development went on. So would you say that actually, like for example, Wallworm, obviously, stuff like this, how much of a part did that play in terms of like unlocking new even processes at all that previously we just wouldn't exist? Like, do you guys think that it just basically allowed you to improve not just your efficiency, but also in terms of like objective quality, what you were able to put out? Like, did it sort of put you guys down specific thought processes when it came down to developing content? Like, because one of the things that I've noticed as an example is like when you get access to a whole new pipeline and you can do things a lot faster, or you can do things even just more efficiently, like to a higher degree, maybe your compile time goes lower or something like that. It ends up actually translating into higher quality stuff a lot of the time, just because you have like it's like your brain doesn't have to account for all of the shortcuts that you had to remember constantly beforehand, or all of the little trivia things that, oh, if this breaks this way, I've got to do this to fix it and stuff like that. So I'm curious as to either one of you guys, if there was ever a point where, because of an advancement in the technical side, you guys were able to level up the actual, like the objective quality of it, instead of it just purely being an efficiency thing.
I mean, yeah, in terms of the environment art, like as I was going through, we could really push the envelope of what was possible in terms of after that displacement limit was raised, for sure. And Shawn kind of got me familiar with the sculpting tools. My brain it took a step back for sure, and I started looking at the bigger picture of things and what we could pull off. And so I definitely got a chance to really expand on the shapes of like the environments, because I wasn't worrying about like map leaks anymore, or like small petty things that the source engine would hang us up on, and I could actually focus on creating a composition instead of something that just functions, period.
Yeah,
for sure. So as we were going through that process, I definitely can notice a shift of what was possible and how my brain looked at things, for sure. And for example, like the foliage tools that we used to place, instead of going through and hand placing down grass by grass, it's just like you're looking at an area of stuff and you're just painting right over it. And like, it's like, let's move on. We can focus on more important things now. So
that's why it's also easier to sketch out things, right? To see if it works.
Yeah. The process for iteration is just so much quicker when you can get it in the engine and you can see final results. Because waiting around for those compile times, if we can get that anything lower. So Shawn, I don't know if you had any other breakthroughs that you realized working on it.
Yeah, I think there were two sort of areas that really helped us speed things along, and they sort of pertain to 3ds Max in a way. The first would be I think this is something that Cat Food you might be more familiar with, because we managed to get some of the enhanced static prop lighting that I think CSGO has, where it calculates per pixel rather than per vertex, which wasn't a base stock source engine feature. And that completely transformed the way we were able to art scenes, because at least in the old mod versions of the game, we were using the old source vertex lighting, and you just couldn't use models for so many things because they would just light horribly. Or if you blended them into a displacement, it would be really bright compared to the displacement, or it would have wrong lighting. So when we were able to do that, we were then able to actually utilize models for so much more. And when you combine that with the workflow that we had with 3ds Max, that then just made life for arting maps considerably easier, because lots of the janky workarounds we had to do to get props to light properly, or to just not use props at all, really, really transformed the way we could art the maps.
Right.
And then the other thing that we made quite a lot of use of throughout Zen specifically was instancing. And the team has quite a love-hate relationship with instancing, because it has a lot of problems of its own, and the source implementation isn't the best.
Is it is it like instancing in Hammer, or like that you have like different VMF files, or instancing in 3D Max?
So it's kind of a combination of the two, because basically, the Hammer instancing allows you to pull other VMFs into a central VMF.
Yeah.
And what we were doing was we were actually augmenting that with 3ds Max. So for example, one of the issues the artists had when they were bringing their levels into 3ds Max is the maps are really complicated, very labyrinthian, and they have a lot of complex entity work throughout them, and they would just load very slowly. So one of the things we were doing was we were breaking the maps down into sections, which were instanced. And then we were even further breaking those instances down into things like we had an instance called the art instance, which would be just displacements and props. So only things that would concern the artists. And then the artists could pull those instances into Max, do all of their magic, and then they could actually just save the VMF, and they wouldn't have to touch the main map file that had all the complex work in it. It would just be updated. And then whenever a mapper recompiled it, all the changes would be there and reflected immediately. So we didn't have to do any complex merging processes or back and forth quite as much when we were using it. So it really helped speed things along.
Yeah, that's very smart. It's also like allows you to work to have like different artists work on at the same time on the same level, and then
Yeah, I think it eliminated a lot of bottlenecks because we'd have LDs that need to do like IO work, and I'm like trying to merge in props, but when you can just update the instance that it all comes in live time, it definitely sped things up.
Personally, I think that something that we too bad we didn't learn at day one was what Chon just explained of splitting the displacements and props, because initially, even when we were using displacements, we were sending this instance to max, but it would include all the brushes and all the entity work, etc. And then the artist, who a lot of times had no idea what entities really were, like the IO, right? And might be like, oh, I don't want this block here, and delete it. And they don't realize like, oh, that's actually some chain of entities, right? But so early on, we weren't really super efficient with that. But once we kind of figured out how to break it up logically like that, then it made things a lot more smooth.
Right. Because was it also difficult because this was like the first time you worked together on a game, or no? Like with such a big team?
I mean, I joined in 2017, so yeah, I was one of the later artists to join, and I kind of came in right as everything was coming into play, and Shawn he definitely massively helped me get up to speed with the tools, and
cool.
Yeah, once we got to that point.
Yeah, but also like managing personnel, like I think that just like on its own is like very difficult to do, like with such a big team.
Yeah. I think we started on Skype when I joined, and Discord was definitely the big improvement for organizing and stuff. And yeah.
Yeah, I can't imagine trying to organize everything on Skype. That must have been a bit of a nightmare.
Yeah, you bet.
We used to use Skype at a private forum. That was our means of organization.
Yeah.
And then when we released on retail, I think the mod was released by what I call the old timers. So there was a lot of older team members, and the team's always been roughly the same size, I think. But around the time we went retail, I think about half the old timers left, and then another half of the team came on, and us three are all relatively new timers. And so there was a whole learning process there as well.
There's a balance of people on Black Mesa who contributed to the mod as a passion, and this was kind of like a part-time thing, and they have full-time jobs. So we had people we needed to rely on that weren't really there. I was here full-time, like pumping stuff out, and we had another couple team members that came on full-time by the end of it. But there was, for a bit there, kind of a disconnect because, we were waiting on an asset, but it's a week, and he's off at his actual job doing his important stuff and making a living. Making a living on Black Mesa, at that point for the mod, it just it wasn't possible. And I think that's really a blessing that Valve gave, at least to me and a lot of other team members, being able to sell on Steam. It's a livelihood, and we can really pour our whole attention into it. And
I was thinking of asking this later on because you guys of course contact with Valve. Did you guys have like any restrictions, or what did they say? Like, can you share anything about that?
Valve has pretty much been completely hands off.
Cool.
They pretty much just said we could sell it on Steam, and that's about it. They've given us support when we've needed it for certain technical things.
Right.
Not source engine related things, more about publishing on Steam.
I was going to say,
And we've maybe had one or two nice comments, normally offhand and not directly to us, but that's been pretty much our entire relationship with Valve.
Cool. Yeah, nice. That's good. That's good to hear that. Yeah.
I sort of want to talk about so obviously Kefu was alluding to potential restrictions, maybe thematically or something, where you're kind of messing around with Valve IP, and maybe they want to
change Gordon into Mario, right?
Yeah. maybe they want to make some changes or stop you guys from making other changes is potentially what could have happened. But it's cool to hear that they were hands off instead. I want to go from a different angle here, because whenever you're talking about a classic game, a game that has a lot of fans from way back when they first played it, and you guys decide, all right, let's go in and work on a new version of that. Let's rehash it. Let's sort of maybe not remaster it in the same way, but one of the things that I felt when I played through Black Mesa, which is admittedly a while ago before this most recent update, was that the Earthbound stuff obviously felt very faithful in terms of a recreation. And something that we've already sort of touched on, Zen obviously was more of an original creation in that respect. It was longer than the original version of Half-Life 1 Zen. It obviously had a lot more content in there. And so the experience was certainly different than maybe people had not only expected from coming from Half-Life 1, but also just playing through the Earthbound section of Half-Life or of Black Mesa and feeling like it was more of a faithful recreation. I'm curious as to if there was a conversation when you guys sat down to start thinking about Zen, as to who essentially may have decided, let's try to really make this our own thing instead of as much of a faithful recreation as can be. Or was that a decision that was already made before you guys came on? I'm just curious as to some sort of background onto what sort of prompted the decision to make Zen so radically different than what we had experienced up until that point.
So the decision was made to release the 2012 version of the mod without Zen, primarily because we were having, well, I wasn't on the team at the time, but I'm aware of a lot of this stuff. There was a lot of difficulty in getting anything cohesive and solid sorted out. So what basically happened was the team agreed to try and release the mod in 2012 without Zen, and then the idea would be Zen would come afterwards. And sort of in that period around 2012, 2013, there had been attempts made at making Zen maps, and actually those attempts were quite faithful. So I know we had, for example, there was a fully, almost not arted, but there was a fully completed and blocked out version of the original Zen map, the one with the floating islands and the hamburger island.
Yes.
And basically, it effectively came down to, wow, this isn't good. The sort of principle that we'd applied while developing Black Mesa was we would try and be faithful to the original where it was good and where things made sense. And then in other areas where we thought that we could do a bit better or we could do something a bit more interesting with it, we tried to take it in our own direction. And the result was that over this time, we kind of thought, why don't we do that with all of Zen? Because these versions that we've made that are close to the original aren't very good. We don't think it's very fun. And, you know, because we've been putting it as this secondary project, because it was something that was going to come after the mod release, the idea was supposed to be, let's make it a more complete package, something a bit more interesting, something a bit more unique. And so then lead level designer at the time, Chris Horn, he came up with this whole set of concepts and very detailed plan for how all of Zen was going to be. And that pretty much was the basis for our original vision that we followed, was kind of came from his mind at the time after the mod version had been released.
Cool.
I know that for my part, it would have actually been really hard to sustain myself for 5 years just doing a recreation. Like, I don't think that I would have been as faithful as the rest of the guys who have, some of them been here for 16 years working on the game. If it was just strictly a recreation, I love Half-Life, but not so much that I want to spend 16 years making someone else's stuff. Right.
Yes.
So I thought it was a good decision by the team to not be completely faithful.
Was it a decision that had like a lot of sort of, maybe not, drama might be the wrong word, but maybe was there any pushback among the team members or any sort of assessment that maybe you guys at some point crossed some line where you went too far? Was there any sentiment like that, or was everybody pretty much on board in the development team when it came to this decision?
As far as I can remember, the team unanimously wanted to do it this way and kind of take it in our own direction and do our own thing with it. The area where there was sometimes a bit of conflict was areas where we thought we might be pushing the envelope a bit too far, because basically one of the really core principles that the team had is we all really cared about following Half-Life style design while still trying to push the boundaries and do our own unique and interesting things with it. But everyone kind of has their own exact definition for what are the boundaries of Half-Life design. Yes. So there would be some things that we would implement where some team members would go, no, we can't do this. This is pushing it too far. It's not right. And then we'd have a bit of back and forth in there. But in terms of actually just doing our own original thing with it and sort of taking it in its own direction, there was never really much pushback in that area as far as I can remember. It was pretty much just down to the specifics of the way we were doing it.
Yeah, it should be maybe even was like refreshing, because like you have been like you have been so strict by the initial design of Half-Life, and now you were like you could like be way more creative, like design wise, like layout wise. So I also like read like a lot of comments that a lot of people think Zen is this way. It's like a lot better than the original one. I also think this, by the way. So it's like because I said this like off stream earlier. That like I think I played like through Half-Life like when I was young like 10 times, but I never finished Zen. I always quit. And now it's actually fun, right? Now you want to keep on going, and it's like it's not frustrating anymore. And yeah, so I think you guys did a really good job of that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's really nice to hear.
All right.
So maybe shall we also load up the game, or what do you guys want to do? Maybe we can show you.
Well, we've
show
been
you
talking
work.
about Zen a lot. Maybe we can pop in. I'm not sure if there. Again, I don't know any of the file names. I'm the guy who's just being directed at this point. So if you guys have a file name of a map you want to show, or one of those early screenshots that we were talking about earlier, whatever you guys want to go into right now is totally fine by me.
If we wanted to look at the Zen opening, you could just go to campaign and start a new game from the Zen chapter. That's pretty much the first level. Pretty much encompasses our entire philosophy with what we were trying to do with Zen. So I think that's probably most relevant to what we were just talking about.
All right, let's just wait for it to load up then. Now I'm curious as to if there was a point where you guys were sort of deciding, okay, let's do something a little bit different, right? I'm curious as to sort of how much of what is in Zen right now feels like very rooted and inspired within the original version, because obviously you guys have to make a decision at some point. Let's change some stuff up and let's go a different way. Like one thing that I'm already noticing is that we've got a sort of a cinematic opener right now, and Half-Life was almost like a game that, aside from that one time where you're getting carried out and thrown into a dumpster by guards, there's almost no cutscenes in the whole game. So I was curious as to, I mean, obviously this is a very small opening shot. It's really just an establishing shot. But was there any thought process as to stuff like that going on?
Yeah, so it's funny that you mentioned that, because that was when I mentioned there were some arguments over the specifics of how we should do things. This was one of the more contentious things that we ended up going with. I can't actually fully remember the exact rationale behind it now, because the argument I think was in something like 2015 or 2016. But it was really supposed to be, we knew that some players would be approaching Zen from the perspective of they haven't played Black Mesa for 4 or 5 years. They're loading up the world now. We wanted to try and root the objective and kind of seed in some of the stakes, because one of the things we thought that the original Half-Life 1 version of Zen lacked was kind of stakes and a sense of objective. So we actually just kind of wanted to show the Nihilanth to begin with, so that it's like it makes more sense when you face him at the end, and then also he's actually cradling the tower top at the start, again kind of indicating that that's where you're going to end up heading. So a little bit of design there. And I remember in the versions of the map that didn't have that opening, it really wasn't landing very well. And we just found that we were able to implement something that we thought was quite neat. And we still felt one of the things that we did do with Black Mesa, which I think some purists may disagree with, but this was just kind of our interpretation. We tried to incorporate some more Half-Life 2 style design principles throughout it as well, because we think Half-Life 2 really kind of expanded on what it means to be Half-Life and that style of design and those kinds of constraints. And so the cinematic cutscene there, for example, it wouldn't have been out of place in Half-Life 2, because they had, the G-Man cinematics and stuff like that. Yeah. So that was kind of our own internal justification for why we thought something like that could work and be interesting, as long as we didn't overdo it. So that's why we I think there's only 2 proper cinematics in the whole of Zen, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I believe there's one towards the end, if I had to guess.
Yeah.
All right. What was the sort of thought process behind some of the art direction? Because I've noticed that one of the things that's interesting about Zen is obviously you have that sort of, I imagine it's somewhat of a scripted sequence where you walk out here, the title shows up, and the creatures fly around, and you get this sort of ominous tower view in the distance, which is obviously goes to what you were saying earlier, Chon. But I'm curious as to sort of like, how do you go about reimagining something that's supposed to be so alien and otherworldly, but obviously has very low definition graphics, considering how far we've come since the original Half-Life?
So I think back in, was it 2013 when Mark Foreman started doing the base textures, Shawn? It was around then, or 2014, I think. Our principal artist, Mark Foreman, he's a substance design legend. If you aren't aware, he did.
I would call him a resident badass, actually.
Yeah, he did the lead environment art for The Witcher 3, a lot of direction for that. And so his interpretations, he basically just went through the wad of all the Half-Life 1 textures and took a look, and whatever his brain kind of interpreted out of that, he went in. Like, you can see that's actually our obsidian and the 4-way blend down there. The blue, that was one of his first materials, I think. And he also created the skybox. So I think when the skyboxes came together, that was a really defining moment for the mood and like the tone of how we wanted to do things. So
yeah, skyboxes are so cool.
They're phenomenal. They're
how big are they? Like, I mean, they're like a spear. They're not really a skybox, right? Or
they're
skybox textures.
Yeah. Are they 4Ks or are they 2? I can't remember.
2K.
Okay, so I know the actual texture is 2K, and then we also do have an actual mesh sphere in the 3D sky of like the star field and a couple other things in there to kind of amp the effect up. But yeah, the textures really helped there. So
that's so cool.
We had a nightmare with the skybox. That was one of the hardest things to get right. I think there were about 10 versions of it before we got this one from Mark. And he just nailed it's amazing because one of the problems we were having was everything was so low res looking, it just never held up. And then we thought that we'd need to up the resolution, and it was really causing, I think when we experimented with it, it was causing massive performance impacts when we increased it higher. And then Mark Foreman was just somehow able to turn in this skybox that's the same resolution as all the other ones, but doesn't look bad. And I think he just managed to go for this very sort of painted, abstract look that holds up well despite the low res, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get what you mean.
think
Yeah.
Mark Foreman may actually be the new incarnation of Bob Ross. Really. The substance version of Bob Ross.
I'm excited to boot up Cyberpunk and see his latest. So.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, I mean.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. No, after you.
All right. So one of the things that I noticed is that you guys have these sort of responsive things. Like this is another area where I feel like the art direction is almost like you have to infer. You've got to really look at what the initial stuff was, and almost like there's a big talk of AI upscaling to improve the looks of older 3D games, but at some point you have to wonder, like, how is anybody supposed to necessarily know what the initial intent was behind this really tiny texture? And so another piece of that, I think, is the fact that you guys have things like this plant over here where if I walk over to it, it sort of shrivels up and sort of responds. It's not the same thing as a texture, obviously, but the idea is they're like trying to give the locale, the setting, a little bit more life, where it's more than just this animated light that, peeks out and maybe moves around a little bit back and forth. It's actually responding to the player's interactions. And to that end, I'm curious as to, like, I'm sure there's a lot of other things that you guys might be able to go in about this, but were there things where you decided that you might have ideas to further the theme? And this doesn't necessarily have to be limited to Zen either, but ways for you to say, here's what we think they were trying to go at with the theme of a level. Let's see how we can like maximize this or push this another area or something that complements that theme. So if you guys have anything to say about stuff like that, particularly since we are walking around Zen right now, that was something that I always thought was pretty interesting, that there's like just those subtle touches where the environment sort of responds to the player moving around.
I think Chris Horn did most of those little actual like entity elements. We had like concept art of these awesome graphite sketches that those were based on. Like thinking about the Interloper art, I think it had gotten to the point, because what I was going to mention was that like Mark Foreman never, like I said, a lot of people were part-time, not around a lot. So I think that it might have worked in our favor, actually, because once we got these sets of, base textures and other assets, like the other artists on the team like had this disconnect, and they were able to infer from what Mark had created, like in another subset of assets from that we derived. So it's kind of interesting how that came out to play, because by the time I had gotten there, I'd seen all these assets laid out for me, and I kind of built upon that. And I know the level designers had to get a little creative with the world textures too, to come up with some of the elements in the levels. So in terms of the interactability, though, Chon might be able to open up on that more.
Yeah, so as Matt mentioned, a lot of that did come from the mind of Chris Horn and his original plans. I think some of that might be in the folder I sent you, actually, if you wanted to look at that a bit later. He came up with a lot of the ideas for kind of what he thought Valve might have been going for in the original Half-Life 1 versions, like what the different bits of environment were supposed to be, what the kinds of plants were meant to be, how the ecosystem worked and stuff like that. A lot of the sort of fine environmental detail came from that. And then, as Matt mentioned, there was sort of a two-stage process where we kind of got a lot of the high-level art from Mark Foreman, and sort of those were interpretations of Half-Life 1's textures. And then we also built this into our plan for the way that all of Zen was going to be developed and the way it progressed through the different biomes. And sort of we had the Badlands, which are the first sets of maps, following by the swamps, then Gonarch's Lair, which is kind of more basalt columns, and then Interloper, which is sort of more along the lines of Half-Life 1's interpretation. And so it kind of all came together where we started with trying to be faithful to the original, and then as the assets came in and the artists started working on them, we tried molding them into this more high-level overview of how Zen was going to progress the whole way through. And then it just kind of worked out in the way you see it today, with lots of different colors and shapes. But there's actually a lot of the DNA of the original in there if you look carefully enough. It's just very hidden behind us taking it in a totally different direction. But Mark Foreman specifically, because he did nearly all the world textures that we use, he pretty much was going one-to-one recreations of the Half-Life 1 versions with whatever he interpreted them as, like Matt mentioned. So kind of a blend of Go on, Sean, sorry.
It definitely spills out. So if you turn, hopefully I'm synced that I can. If you turn around where you're at, the other way, turn left 90 degrees, and go up to that wall there.
The blue one with all the
go up. Just follow the path around here a little bit.
Okay.
To the right, and to the right around that. I think there's a delay here. So stop right here. Okay, so you're gonna. I think we're out of sync, but Mark did
a second or two.
A bunch of these textures, and some of these you're going to see on the walls. There's these little that look like, say,
if you look to the left,
starfish. You'll see there. So those textures are part of the world textures. But then when Brian Dale was in here putting up the rocks on this scene, he's like, "Oh man, it'd be really cool if we actually had props." So eventually, and there's some around here, right around here somewhere, you're going to find actual props of that were like inspired directly from this texture. That he just wanted to make actual ones come out. So basically what I'm saying is a lot of things, they just kind of fed on top of each other, and that's very normal when you get something, someone has something, they give it to you, it looks kind of cool, then it inspires you for the next little thing, and then people look at it and they're like, oh, that's cool, and what about this? And it's kind of a round robin process of creativity, really.
Yeah, that's a really nice flow.
I think another case of that is probably these sort of these little grim fate fellas over here who are also in their own suits. I imagine I can't recall anything like that being an aspect.
At least he's not a zombie, right?
You'll notice they all have name tags that represent all of the guys on the team.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'm in this map.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so that was one of those things that I always thought was interesting about. When I first loaded into this area, one thing that did strike me is that you have this opportunity to explore. And that's an area where obviously because you're going into this new zone, I mean, in a way, Zen felt a bit more like an expansion pack with regards to how Black Mesa operated, as opposed to just another level for that respect. So I imagine that goes back to what we were talking about earlier with the whole idea of the level being, or the pack being essentially something very different from Earthbound. And I had speculated at first, maybe the developers wouldn't necessarily be quite so happy with how Earthbound felt relative to Zen, which is something that we also talked about earlier. So obviously not having seen all of the changes to Earthbound, I'm curious as to if there's anything in particular that working on Zen reminded you guys of that sort of it's almost like when you work on, project one in year one, and then in year two you work on another project. Afterwards, you can only see the flaws of the first one and how far you've grown since working on the first one, just by virtue of continuing to work. So, was there anything in particular that Zen kind of taught you guys about stuff that if you had learned those lessons earlier, you could have applied them to the initial draft of Earthbound?
So I think on a high level, there were two things in terms of design. I think Matt might have some more examples for art, but one of the things we realized was the utilization of the full level space, and combat spaces specifically ties into that. So one of the things we were really conscious of while we were making Zen was we wanted to make sure that the players were able to explore the whole space, and that the core gameplay, the main linear path actually utilizes the space really well. So we had this sort of looping design on a lot of the parts, and a lot of sense of able to see your objective up ahead and then move that way. And then just making sure that when you're fighting in combat spaces that you're able to move throughout the whole space. It serves as an effective arena. And one of the things we noticed that we hadn't done so well in Earthbound was that a lot of the combat spaces, players were getting actually funneled at the entrances to those combat spaces, and they're not really moving around the arenas that we designed for them, because we either weren't pulling them into the space effectively enough, or we hadn't properly safeguarded against players doing cheesy things in combat.
Right.
So when we went back and revisited it, we did a lot to try and make sure that, hey, if you're having a fight in this arena, you're fighting in this arena. You're not just peeking back and forth through a door, or going in and out, and you're actually moving around the arena. We're somehow incentivizing the player's movement and stuff like that.
Yeah,
that was kind of one of the big gameplay things that went into. We put a lot of thought into Zen in making sure that, if we're going to have all of these incredibly beautifully arted sections with lots of original, interesting design, we want to make sure that players actually experience that. And then we kind of backwardsly applied that to Earthbound, because there were a lot of parts in Earthbound where there were very extraneous areas that didn't really serve much of a purpose, or players would just skip through them, or players wouldn't use a lot of the spaces that we built. The other design thing
Sorry, I also thought it worked really well with it's the I forgot the name of the big one with the ball sack. Yeah, like where there's like a lot of spots where you like fall through the cobwebs and you're instantly into a fight, right? That works really well.
Yeah, and again, that was something we tried to do in Earthbound. Actually, was that we tried to make it so that you go into a combat space, you know you're about to fight, and you're stuck there. You have to fight.
Yeah, I also had this like I'm not sure if you played not the last Doom, but the one before. There's like it's also called Doom, right?
Yeah.
A lot of these arenas had exactly like that. Like if you have like a bunch of enemies in the arena, you just go back to the where you came from. You can just like peek around the corner, and they didn't have like enough points there, so they were just like stuck in the arena. You could shoot them from a distance. That's so cheeky. It's like it's no fun. So that's a really good decision. Yeah.
That Doom was a major inspiration for some of our design principles, actually.
Right. Of Doom. It was a really cool game. But like there were some of those spots where you could like, you could be like super cheeky and just wait them up, and then anyway.
We literally have like a channel in our Discord to just like gush over Doom because it is a great game. Yeah, like not to like, oh, let's copy this. Just like, oh, this was so awesome.
Yeah. Did you guys already play the new one, like the last one?
I haven't gotten to Eternal yet myself, but
no, me neither. So looks really cool though.
I didn't have a lot of time to play games over the last couple.
It's the same, yeah.
But but going back to what Pernogo, was saying about that leveling up analogy for at least for the art stuff, I can relate to that a lot, especially coming from. I think that first year of working on the game was a lot of learning experiences, and I was doing that in tandem with school and taking a lot of traditional art classes. So by the time I was out of it, I had completely changed my perspective of how I approached these levels. And so I can definitely remember the Zen phase being that learning, and then we get into Gonarch, and I'm starting to pick up my pace. And by Interloper, it was just like, we had our deadline, but I felt like I was concise, and I knew why I was making the decisions I was making, and I was able to pull that off now that I knew how to utilize the engine to its fullest extent. And so I think going back into Earthbound, it's just like that culmination of all these like little art tricks and all that stuff. Like you said, it speeds you up to a point where you're making stuff that you couldn't even imagine in the first place. And I think that definitely is evident. I wish I could find a proper comparison of the surface tension cliffs, but if you load those up and see what we were able to pull off thanks to Shawn's tools, it's just evident in our products. Like now that we've learned a lot coming along this journey. So
I'm curious as to the thought process behind the sort of some of the changes that I've noticed in general from the original version of Zen and this one is you're leveraging the boosting and the fact that you have increased mobility as a player. You guys seem to be leveraging that a lot better, which probably leads back to the idea of making more effective use of the space in a level design sense. But I'm curious as to what sort of inspired. For example, I believe this is the case. I might be mistaken, but it feels like there's way less risk of fall damage in Black Mesa Black Mesa Zen compared to Half-Life 1 Zen. And that seems like it was almost, assuming that is the case and it's not just placebo, it feels like the reason for that is because you want the player to be encouraged to leverage the fact that they have the double jump or they have the long jump and they have all of these other elements that they can sort of use to navigate these expansive levels, which I'm also just going to go out on a limb here and say on a technical side, I figure you guys probably weren't, the tools were not in position at the beginning of Black Mesa's development to do anything close to this level of scale, because just looking at how wide the areas are and compared to the more boxy style of some of the older levels. So, but as far as the gameplay is concerned, were there any concerns that changing something like fall damage in that respect, or essentially reducing its how high it's stated? Because I do feel like it's very punishing in the earlier titles. So I'm curious as to your guys' thoughts on the level or the gameplay impact of mobility, how that was leveraged in Zen. Whereas if you compare that to the original Half-Life 1 Zen, doesn't really feel like it was it was stated as well as it could have been. We'll say.
You've pretty much already hit the nail right on the head, to be honest. There actually is no fall damage in Zen. We took it away completely. And the reason was because we wanted to encourage players to utilize the long jump. And we found that a lot of the times you would just randomly take fall damage and you wouldn't really be sure why. So we kind of went in with the design principle that anywhere in Zen there'll be no fall damage, but if we don't want the player to fall somewhere, we'll just make it so that it will be a death fall. And the reason was basically, as you mentioned, in the original, there were lots of places where you would be jumping around and you suddenly take fall damage, and you think, why? Why have I just taken damage? I haven't jumped that far. And it was actually especially evident in the first map of Zen, where you had these floating islands you would jump down,
Yes.
and then on some of them you would just take damage, and you just think, how was I supposed to know I was going to take damage there?
Yeah, it wasn't intuitive at all. Yeah.
And we even boosted the player's mobility quite a lot, because we allow long jumping in multiple directions, for example, and because it's a double jump now rather than a control crouch, you can do it a lot more flexibly. And so we just wanted to really promote players being able to utilize that. And one of the big reasons is because one of the major design challenges of Zen, and this is something that Valve definitely grappled with in the original, is you're basically removing a good half of the sandbox when the player goes into Zen, because on Earthbound, you have the soldiers to fight, and they're really fun and dynamic and interesting, and then suddenly they're gone. And then even in Zen itself, you're a bit limited into what you can use in a lot of spaces. So, for example, we didn't use the Vortigons or the A-Grunts or the controllers until Interloper, which I think Valve also did as well. And then you've got a really limited enemy sandbox and a really a more limited sort of just environment to play around in compared to Earthbound, really. So we kind of just wanted to make sure that anything that we did in Zen that was interesting was expanded on and allowed freedom for player expression and movement. So the long jump was one of those really big areas where we just decided we're going to make sure the player can long jump around everywhere. We're going to make a really big deal out of it, but we're also not going to make it frustrating like it was in the original. We're going to make sure that you're properly tutorialized. So this level is a great example of how we tutorialize that, because you get a bunch of easy jumps first. You get a safe jump over a bridge where you get grabbed by the barnacle over the water, and then you get into some harder jumps. But even those hard jumps, they're kind of downhill and they're over long distances. So you don't overshoot, you don't go too far, you don't miss. It's pretty easy. And then we start putting some harder platforming in the next map, which comes just after this one, which you're about to reach. So yeah, just a lot of attempts to really tighten up that core design is where a lot of that came from.
Were there elements at a point where you took out that final safety stop and you let the risk run of them going too far? I can't even remember it now.
I'm not sure we ever really do that, because frankly, one of the things that was so frustrating in there is when you overshoot a long jump.
Yeah, I think I remember that came up in playtests a lot. People just didn't understand the concept of airstrafe stopping. That's something that we all have it muscle wired into our heads, and at a point we didn't even second thought that, and then we get the initial play test coming in, and people were ice skating around for a bit, but Chon did a fantastic job of really measuring it out and dialing those elements in. So
well, that's another thing too, is that obviously the gameplay that you have in regular Half-Life, in Earthbound, so to speak, is much more, you don't have the long jump, you don't have the same mobility, and so since chronologically you just receive this as you're getting warped out to Zen, it obviously makes more sense to give them a little bit of time to not only explore the new environment, but also explore their new options in terms of gameplay. Did you guys feel like that there was any invalidation of previous so the concern I would have anyway as a game designer would be I'm changing a huge part of how the player incorporates their movement into the gameplay space. Obviously this also happened in the original Half-Life, so you're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place either way, because you don't want to remove it because it's a part of the original game and it's part of what made the level important. But just by virtue of changing it, you risk maybe potentially invalidating the way that players actually play the game, right? The way that a player would express their play style. And so I'm curious as to how you guys sort of grappled with that, or if that even came up as a sort of thought process. Is obviously maybe the expectation was already there that it would be there because Half-Life 1 had it. So that kind of, in a way, it saves your bacon a little bit. But was there ever a thought where maybe some strategies, maybe some weapons, maybe some tools that the player had just didn't mesh as well with the extra mobility? And on the flip side, if there's anything I can imagine the rocket launcher being able to put more distance between it and yourself becomes pretty useful as well. So I'm sure there's all sorts of different changes that happen to the sort of meta game, if you can call it that. But curious as to if anything like that came up in playtesting, any concerns that you guys had, or anything that you're maybe still not even satisfied with, because I know some tools just don't get used, right? I don't think I've ever seen too many people use the satchel charge, for example. So yeah, there's stuff like that I'm sure you guys could speak on.
I wasn't
so
really
the one that comes
Go
on, Sean. I've talked too much. Your turn.
I was just saying that I wasn't really involved in discussions about that in particular. but I'm having a view about it that's more like that's part of game development itself, because every time you get a new item or a new gun or a new thing, you always progress and have to change to account for that anyway. That's just kind of part of the process, in my view. But I wasn't part of this conversation directly, so Chon would have a better view on it.
No, I think that's exactly right. The other thing I was going to mention is one of the specific areas that we struggled with was we found players were chaining long jumps together too easily, because in the original you could just do it infinitely, and because we've increased player flexibility by allowing you to long jump in any direction, for example, and by putting it on the double jump to make it even easier to do that, we found against Gonarch, for example, players were just long jumping away from him all the time, and he wasn't really posing much of a threat. So we implemented a system that we call the long jump mana system, which is there's 3 bars next to your suit battery there, and that's the amount of charge that your long jump has, and each bar represents a jump. So eventually, if you jump too many times consecutively, basically, we prevent players from being able to continue jumping. And so we were a bit worried when we did this, because we knew a lot of people in the original really enjoyed the fact that they could just chain jumps together infinitely, and it was kind of a fun way of expressing themselves. But we just found that the gameplay, it really hurt the gameplay the way we designed it, and we just kind of decided to try and take it in our own direction to work around those limitations. So that was one of the examples I could think of.
For me, it took quite a while to figure out there was like a maximum amount of long jumps. So that I think you did a good job on like the recharge time, right? Because I like to long jump as well, but I also like to look at the scenery and everything. So I think that's I think because I didn't miss the extra jump or anything, so I think that's nice.
Yeah, it's balanced out such that like you basically, if you could do 4 in a row, I think, but by the time the recharge is ready. And you might even be able to do 5, depending on if there's like a micro stutter in the middle of it or something. So yeah, it's still pretty generous. It's just not infinite like the original.
Yeah.
I think that's the beauty of the expansiveness of Zen. You can choose to either long jump through it quickly or stop and appreciate the scenery, and whatever you choose to do, people seem to enjoy it. So
that's pretty cool. Yeah, there's a ton of different ideas. Oh, go ahead, Cat Food.
No, I was gonna. I'm also curious what you guys have to say about like the earlier levels, because this is really cool, and maybe we can also like show another Zen level later on. But I think I already told one of you. I can't remember who I talked to, but like that the original level design is already, the Half-Life level design is like timeless already, kind of, right? It's so good still. I'm kind of curious how if you like what did you add to that, or what areas did you like change at all? Because like for me, it's like such a long time ago I played Half-Life, so I couldn't really. I thought most of the military fights and everything like were kind of the same, or are there like areas where you can just go right now and you can say like, okay, we changed this because of this problem, or new mechanics, or.
So as you mentioned before, we were with Earthbound, we were reasonably faithful to Half-Life 1, not perfect. We did change a few things in some places. I think a lot of it was because in a lot of areas, the original just had really strong design and really strong, really fun. So we didn't really want to touch any of that. One example I can think of is some of the later maps in Surface Tension, which myself and Matt worked on. Matt, did you help with Surface Tension on Cut? I can't remember.
I was not around during the end.
That was around when I started. Was when we were working on the what we call it, Surface Tension Uncut, or
yeah. So that was one of the areas where we really went quite hard on actually changing some things in the original, because the last maps of Surface Tension in the original were not good, but they conveyed an important story point with the soldiers losing the war against the aliens and it starting to become a losing battle on Earth. So we kind of
forgot about Freeman.
Yeah, exactly. So it was a segue into Forget About Freeman. And so we kind of just took that and really ran with it and tried to expand on that a lot. And the rationale was mostly, again, this is an area where the original maybe didn't do as good a job as it could have. And we felt that expanding on it would benefit the game overall. Yep.
And that was also when we first, Chetan's Magic with CSM, we first introduced that, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
I'm curious. I know Cat Food has some questions about the physics stuff that you guys have accomplished. I'm curious because I just noticed a bunch of debris flying around and stuff after blowing up an explosive barrel. So I'm curious as to, I don't know.
I was just gonna, it's not a compliment. It's just like I really like how you use like the Half-Life 2 puzzles, like the with the barrels on the water and everything. That's really cool. But also the joke that you have to hand over the toilet paper to the scientist. I thought that was really funny. Yeah, I really like that. It keeps it also fresh, right? Because I'm a Half-Life fan. I want to play that game, but I also want to be like surprised. So that's really cool. So I thought you really did a good job on implementing the physics from
this
the
scene in particular. It's a piece of art because Chon did such a well job of chaining the barrels together. Like they'll actually force themselves into the other cluster if you do it correctly, and so it kind of enables this consistency. Like I don't know if you'd have to explain it, Chon, because I think you can go over it better. But the minor little touches that they put in to ensure those things is what makes it really magic, I think.
Yeah, so in that scene that Matt's talking about, the fight that you just did, it actually did happen while you were playing. It's just we didn't really take note of it. The barrels, when you set them on fire, they'll fling themselves into the soldiers.
Right.
And that's actually like a track train setup. So there's a track train with a wall in it which flings the barrels towards the soldiers when they get ignited.
Okay. Yeah,
and then in terms of the other stuff you were saying about the physics being implemented, that relates back to what I was saying earlier about the sort of the desire to bring some more Half-Life 2 like aspects into this game and to kind of unify them a bit better. A lot of the physics stuff came from that because Half-Life 2 just loved its physics, and it's just a fun little thing that gets ignored in a lot of games, I reckon. So we kind of wanted to bring some of that into this.
It's definitely something that I noticed. Another thing that is related to the Half-Life 2 comparison from, comparing Black Mesa to Half-Life 2 instead of Half-Life 1. Half-Life 2 has that like sort of squad AI stuff. I'm curious as to if there was any attempt at changing the AI players so that they behaved a little bit more like what you're used to out of a Half-Life game in a more modern era.
So the soldier AI was completely rewritten from scratch for 1.0 by one of our programmers, Alex. He kind of just set about making the best AI he could within the limits of the source engine. So there was a lot of inspiration drawn from the original, because I think the original Half-Life 1, a lot of people actually still like fighting them over a lot of soldiers in modern games, for example. There was something about them that was so...
Yeah. They're really smart.
So great, yeah.
And it's really funny. As well. Yeah. Go on, sorry.
So he kind of set around, because the base AI in Source is defined by the Combine normally. So we kind of stripped a lot of that out, and he kind of just went really crazy on it. And we had a lot of back and forth trying to get them set up to where they are today. So as you're seeing now, we tried to make them quite dynamic. So they'll run around a lot. They'll sort of take cover. They'll suppress you when you're behind cover, and just kind of... I'm not sure it still necessarily captures the magic of the Half-Life 1 version, but it does its own unique thing within the gameplay framework that we have, because I think our game is a bit more cover-based and a bit more back and forth than the original Half-Life 1, which was very run and gun. So we kind of tried to build them around that.
Yeah, because it's also the recoil different from the machine gun. I thought you had to... Yeah, because you have to... in Black Mesa, you actually have to pull it down, right? In the original Half-Life, there's like no spray pattern or anything. Yeah.
Oh, I didn't even know that. No wonder. I've been playing this wrong this whole fight.
Yeah, we wanted to take out random spread. We didn't really think that it was very fun, especially with the MP5, because I've always thought the MP5 in the original Half-Life was completely useless. So when we were modifying the game for the retail release, I was a real major proponent of trying to make sure the MP5 is a viable weapon. And so the recoil kind of was a part of that, because it still gives you the same kind of kick that the original did, but you can actually control it if you want to.
Yes, yeah. It's a little bit more accurate.
Well, one of the things that I always like is when I hear game developers remove RNG from games. That's my favorite, because, I mean, it's probably because I have such a vested interest in competitive games, but I always view that random stuff that stops you from really really being able to account for every time you hit or miss, right? That's what really gets me personally, is when I want to die because I suck, not because the game decided I die. You know what I mean? So I like to kind of frame it like that, basically. So I imagine it goes back to giving the player more control, and player expression is something that I remember you guys referencing earlier about the sort of original. One of the major things you wanted to change about the Earthbound levels as opposed to the Zen levels, and like something that you guys were able to capitalize on in Zen, you felt, rather than worry too much about making it as faithful, because I do remember that a lot of the levels I mean, I'm thinking back to like, if we look at the bridge in the distance, I keep reminding myself of the bridge in Half-Life 1 Surface Tension, where there's some scripted sequences, and they're kind of neat. I'm sure for the time they were very impressive to have the scripted sequences of that kind of level where you got the helicopter and all that stuff. But it was also like, if you didn't have specific ammo for a certain gun, or if you didn't ammo management prior to that, you kind of were out of luck. You know what I mean? You didn't really have the same fair fight, right? And I just distinctly remember feeling that less in Black Mesa in general, even when I played back the old Earthbound levels. I felt like there was more room for me to work without needing every specific tool for every specific response that the enemies might have. So I'm not sure if you guys can speak to that, and how you guys, maybe, I'm assuming like some of the ammo drop points or some of the placements of weapons that you could pick up were also modified as the levels progressed.
It pretty much came down to us wanting it to be fun for everyone all the time. So we pretty much just wanted to make sure that players could enjoy each encounter in multiple ways, because Half-Life is sort of, it's interesting in the sense that it's both extremely restrictive but also quite open. So you've got like, because the player always has every weapon available to them, apart from whatever you haven't picked up yet.
Right.
And the AI is very dynamic in general. The player has a lot of ways they can approach an encounter, even though the game itself might be extremely linear and sort of force you down a narrow path. So yeah, a lot of the balance tweaks and stuff we did were kind of just built around us testing it and feeling, okay, well, I'm screwed in this fight if I don't have a 357, for example, or I don't have the ammo for the 357. So how can we make sure that if a player gets here without that, how can they still enjoy the combat and how can they still progress? Because I think one of the common criticisms about the mod was, and this was actually something that some people liked as well, so it's a bit of a double, and it was really unforgiving and difficult in the same kinds of way that Half-Life 1 was. And at least for the retail versions, we kind of wanted to change that. So we tried to make sure that all of the weapons were viable, still having their strengths and weaknesses, but that you would be able to complete an encounter without being completely screwed if you didn't have something or other.
Did you apply that methodology to the 1.5 crates, the Half-Life 2 crate callbacks? Like, I know we had a little bit of new balancing going on because we placed those down, so the ammo and weapons spread changed.
Not quite so much, no. That was mostly just giving players another way to interact with the world that, again, was more consistent with Half-Life 2, I think.
Yep.
I'm curious about that. Like, it sounds like there was a lot of inspiration, not just from the original Half-Life 1, but also Half-Life 2. Like, we've talked about some stuff related to the AI and how there's some people who prefer one of those to the other. I'm curious as to how the essentially like how the experience was when you're trying to like sort of gauge the fan reception, right? Because you said earlier, like, some people liked it being really difficult and other people wanted it to be a little bit different. I mean, I guess that's what the hard difficulty was for in theory, right? I'm not actually sure what the hard difficulty changes though. So that's an area where I'm unfortunately relatively ignorant. So I'm not sure if you guys have, like, does it just increase stats, or is there some more intelligent enemies as a result of turning up the difficulty?
There's a few things it changes, but for the most part, it is just damage given and received. There's a couple of small things it changes throughout the game. Like, for example, I think on hard difficulty, the assassins are fully invisible all the time. And then some of the enemies might use their harder attacks more often, but I think that's about it, really.
Right. Does the Gonarch kick up the attack stuff? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that scales. I know
Gonarch
some...
and Nihilanth change quite considerably, I think, on the higher difficulties. They do harder attacks more often.
I'm also looking at the concept arts you sent.
Oh, yeah.
It's also cool to show this, no?
Yeah, definitely.
Maybe talk a little bit about that.
So actually, I'm not sure which one you guys want to go for first. I have a couple of them already loaded up. Looks like the one that I have right now is, let me see what the file name is, INTB1.
Interloper, that is just as you get inside the tower. That's the lower waist facility. So I was responsible for the sculpting of the displacements and the art below. And then our additional art from Brian Dale and even lead Adam Ingalls, he helped out on this level. It was a awesome group effort. So Chon, I don't know if you want to talk about the block out on the left there and the things going on.
It's really wild.
Yep. So this map, this was one of our hell maps. I was the one working on this map for the most part, and I think I must have gone through about 20 versions of it with about 5 major reworks before we settled on the final one. It's the first map when you go inside the tower itself, so it serves as sort of introduction to the interior parts of the tower. And so it was one of those maps that spent a really, really long time in grey box form. So even the version on the left that you see there is actually probably after about 2 years of development.
Wow.
And then that was the one that actually we sort of ended up rolling with. And then Matt kind of went and did an absolute number on it to give you the version on the right. Matt and Brian, they did absolute wonders on that map.
When I was handed this level is probably right about when we were hitting the stride, because we just wrapped up Gonarch, and I think the gap between that block out and that final piece was roughly a year, maybe just under, like 9 months, but it was quite a bit to get it to that point, and there's a lot of iteration that went on. But I guess the left is a good indicator of kind of like what I was handed and what I had to deal with, and
Right.
Wallworm is kind of the clutch here. You can definitely tell that it allowed me to push these shapes out from these block forms that you're so used to seeing in the source engine, and it enabled this aesthetic that hadn't previously been thought possible until this point. So it was really fun to finally be able to open up those organic shapes, because this whole thing is just like this meat carcass, and I don't really have to explain anything too much, and it was just a wild time unleashing that on it. So
Also, how did you guys test it? Do you also test with with a standard group, or do you also try to keep like new testers coming in? Because I think that's also really hard to do, right? Like keep new play testers coming in over like such a long time. Because
there's a lot of internal testing for sure, and then we had our public betas for a while. I'm not sure how many outside testers we brought in, like during internal development, Chon, if you remember. I'm not quite sure.
So it was probably an area where, in retrospect, we probably could have done better, and I think there were ways we could have probably handled it differently if we were to do it again. For the most part, what we really did was we let the level designers basically say, this map is ready for testing,
Right.
and then the whole team would test it. And what we were typically doing was we were getting the team members to record their playthroughs and put them on YouTube as an unlisted video, and then we would kind of sit down, as the level designer would sit down and watch them, and then they'd normally be handed some feedback from the leads based on that playthrough. Right. And we also did get some outside testers, but typically all we really did was team members would get people in their lives who like games, or just someone they know, to come and play it and to give their unfiltered thoughts on it. So it probably, we did test a lot, so there was an awful lot of testing done, but I think the groups of people may have been a little bit too static. So that was one of the issues we had, and sometimes things were very challenging, but we didn't find them challenging because we understood them, or the people who were playing the game were Half-Life veterans, for example. So
and if you get like a first block out, you already kind of know what you're gonna have to do, and then if you see the second one, you already know the goal, right? So that's way easier if you give the second block out to someone that's like will look at it with fresh eyes, let's say. So,
exactly. So we wound up doing a lot of testing, but we probably could have varied the testers a bit more. But luckily, I mean, because we followed the early access model, as Matt mentioned, the betas really helped iron out some of those creases. I do wish, in retrospect, perhaps, that we'd introduced more outside testers earlier into the process, because we might have been able to fix some of the more fundamental problems that some of the parts of the game have. The problem was, by the time we'd got stuff out into the public, they'd already been developed to a certain point where we couldn't have gone back and changed some things as drastically as we might have liked to.
It's stuck,
Yeah, I think there's definitely an internal hesitation to show off some of our work initially, because, like Chon said, there was a lot of iterations, and this came a long way over the years. So at a certain point, Adam says perfection is the enemy of finished. So he kind of was the one that, thank God we had Adam to pull the cord on it, because we probably would have been working forever and ever. And so at a certain point, I remember the first Zen beta going out, and I definitely was like nervous, because it's like really well, really, really bad. But fortunately, it was received pretty well. And that was a relief. And after that point, I think we were a lot more comfortable pushing out those betas and getting feedback from the community. And we value it a lot, for sure. It's integral to getting things done around here. So
nice.
Cool. We also have the benefit that Black Mesa fans are just overwhelmingly just good fans. I'm trying to think of the right word. They just love Black Mesa. So it's like, I think maybe the fear of disappointing them wasn't founded because they wanted this so bad that people have been overwhelmingly positive about
But
this.
maybe then also like because they're like their expectations might be getting higher and higher, and then or no, was it like even if you change something completely, then they were still happy? Or
I think we met their expectation. Chon, I don't know what you think.
I think it was as with I guess any group of people on the internet, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Definitely disappointed some people, but then you always will, right? There's not really any circumstance where that won't happen.
Yes.
So you just have to kind of try and balance out all the feedback you're receiving and kind of make sense of it in your head, kind of. And I'm pleased with the way we managed to stick relatively confidently with our vision while still taking as much feedback as we could. But like I mentioned, I would have liked to have maybe changed things a bit more by introducing them earlier into the process.
Right,
but it is what it is, and we were really happy with the response overall.
Cool.
And as Shawn mentioned, our fans are nuts, and I mean that in the best way possible. And I think most game communities come to appreciate their fans for one reason or another. I think as a member of the CS:GO community, you can probably appreciate that more than most.
Well, like the point you were making like a few moments ago, like I can totally agree with that. You have like different groups of fans. Well, no, like you also have haters. I mean, like of course they're not fans, but they're gonna hate whatever you do, right? Because I don't know, and other people are gonna be like overly positive about it, and I also try to look in the middle, right? If someone is just like it finds everything amazing, whatever you do, it's probably not true. If someone just hates everything about it, then it's probably also not true. So
we also have a good number of fresh players coming in who never played the mod, and we're getting a lot of positive reception from the more general crowd, which is a good receptor because you can listen really closely to the really dedicated members, and it might not reflect what the general audience is also thinking, because those people are so fresh in their head and their muscle memory is trained, and they have these habits formed that they don't even realize they're doing that other people have no idea how to pick up on. So there's a balance of listening to be had, for sure.
Also, was it like sorry, go on.
I just was thinking to myself that something interesting to at least think about is the fact that I know that I grew up where Half-Life is one of the very first games I played, right? And there's a lot of a lot of people have been wanting this and expecting it for a long time. The crowd of people who played the original Half-Life, especially 20 years ago, they might have one view, but there's probably, and I know there are, tons of people who never even played the original Half-Life.
Yes.
And they're young people that come out like this is their first exposure to it,
Right, yeah. But it's also was it like the decision to, we were also talking about this off stream, but that you can like choose every chapter when you load up the game for the first time? Was it like a decision because there's going to be like a lot of players that are going to go play Black Mesa that they don't know Half-Life so well, they just want to go through different chapters just to see it, or was it the different decision?
There's the mix between the people that played the mod, and then Zen finally came out, so they picked up the Steam version. And
right.
Which we honestly, advised against, honestly, because the mod has changed so drastically in Earthbound to the Steam version now that even people who played retail in 2015 and went back through recently were like, I was blown away by the amount of effort was put in over the last just 2 years alone. So, yeah.
Maybe you could have, if there was like another achievement, I don't know, just to force people to play. But also, of course, you don't want to force them.
we have the achievement for carrying like the hat all the way through the game.
And I saw the YouTube video of that, and then I'm not going to spoil the Easter egg, so like, people have to figure it out for themselves. Right? Yeah. I thought it was funny as well.
One of the things that I always am curious about is, like, you guys were talking a lot about fan reception and what the reaction was. And obviously, like, sometimes people are going to be, maybe they don't receive it as well. The thing that I'm curious about is under a normal, I don't even know what a normal circumstance is in game development terms, but if you had a more normal development cycle where it was a relatively solid team that didn't change as much as what you guys had, maybe it was just shorter in terms of the amount of years spent on the product, and then it comes out, it feels like maybe it's because I'm this might just be bias on me not necessarily engaging with all the developers in the world, but it feels like they don't have the same connection as a community driven project as this ends up feeling like, right? And I imagine that also had some contributions. So on some level, I'm sure that there was a point where you're trying to satisfy the community, but particularly when you guys decide to bring on your own ideas and put them into Zen, like we were talking about earlier, at what point, I guess, how do you look back if you had to try to be objective, I guess, and say, regardless of how it was received, here's how I personally feel about it, having been part of the development process. Like, how do you guys look back at the definitive edition that we're now available, and how do you guys assess it? Like, where does it rank in your minds? Are you guys generally satisfied with what you guys were able to put out?
My opinion is everyone probably is, but you're going to get a different answer based off of who you are on the team, probably. I think everyone is super proud of what they got to be participating in here. I know I am pretty happy to have gotten to be part of this myself.
Also, what were the requirements to join a team?
Well, at least for my art app, I had to do a lot of earth, like foliage and grass and organic stuff to prove. Adam, my lead, had the basis, that if I understood, Earth fundamentally, I could apply that to extraterrestrial type of things. So I had a test of making a nice little forest in Source, and that's what got me in. But I had a couple of years on my belt from working on Tower Unite at that point, because I guess my timeline is a little interesting because I joined in 2017, but I'm only 23. I played the mod in 2012, and I applied as a level designer back in I think it was 15, and I wasn't a legal adult yet, so I couldn't sign the non-disclosures for the source.
Right.
Yeah, you definitely had to be an adult, and anyone who I've been working with people who understand the Source engine more than I could ever comprehend, and I've learned so much from them. So yeah, we only have the top heads for people who know the Source engine on the level design side. So
cool. What about you, Shawn? What was it for you, the requirements? So level design.
You said Shawn.
Like I was Shawn. Yeah, go. Whoever
we get this all the time.
Yeah, no, sorry.
We also have a John. It's great.
Okay, yeah. So just call him Wallworm then, Mr. Wallworm.
I had a little art test similar to Matt's, probably just a little scene. Pine trees and rocks and a path on a hill in CS:GO. I think I made it. So
cool.
I think it was that. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds like mine. So, what about you, Chon? Because you actually made On a Rail Uncut, and that was kind of like your leverage to get yourself onto the team, right? You were a modder too.
Yeah, so I was a mod. I made a couple of mods for the mod version of Black Mesa, and then the team approached me, and I did an interview and I did a level design test where I had to make a multiplayer map in 2 weeks. And
cool.
But we hadn't actually hired level designers for a really long time. There were 2 level designers that were hired after me, and then we never looked at level designers again because we had enough, really. We never suffered from having too few level designers, and the level designers we do have on our team are very much Source veterans.
Right.
So it was mostly down, I think, to knowledge of the Source engine and how to make maps on the Source engine for us, and I think that was true for also programmers as well, because Source development, of course, level design has loads and loads of transferable skills that you can apply across any tool and any platform. But when you're working on the Source engine, there's so many specific things you have to be able to do that you wouldn't be able to do on another engine. You have to understand, and you have to be able to deal with the frustration of the Source engine as well.
Yeah, I was going to say, you also need to know about the limitations. Right?
It got to the point of who didn't come on, but who is actually staying to finish the project, because people were using Black Mesa as stepping stone to get to their next opportunities, and we had to stick it out and deal with all the fun bits, but I think it was worth the journey. So,
right.
And this requires the shout out to Chetan, Dennis, all the programmers. I think that I would have shot myself if that was my primary role.
Their internal, just library of source knowledge that they've accumulated over the years, that stuff you couldn't even find on the VDC. It's just that obsolete and it's so petty at some points, but yeah, that's just the nature of game development, I guess. So,
and now that you're you guys are so familiar, I know I also looked on your website, and apparently you guys are working on an Unreal game in Unreal. But I was also curious, like now that you're like so familiar with the Source engine, are you also tempted to do like a what's it called again? The Opposing Force and a Blue Shift remake? So you start laughing. That's probably a no then.
John, you can if you want
to. Pretty much, the development cycle was so long and so grueling, and we said no more.
Never again. Okay, I understand.
We know the fans would really want it, and we think we'd probably be well placed to deliver it. But there's 2 mod teams that are working on different versions of both those games, I believe. And they do look pretty good. And so we just kind of thought, especially with all the groundwork we laid on Zen, we thought we've put ourselves together a pretty talented and passionate studio, and we've learned a lot over the course of this development, and we've now got the resources and expertise that we definitely didn't have before. So we thought, why not take it in our own direction and try and make an actual real studio, making something original and just doing some cool things with what we built.
That might also be nice for the mental health, right? For employees.
Yeah. I don't know if I could handle any more Source, to be honest.
I understand. Yeah, I'm almost. A lot of times I'm also in that same position where I'm going to be like, what am I doing? But yeah, anyway.
John mentioned we had the static prop lighting from CSGO, but we don't have the quality parameters. So all of our static prop lighting 3 it had to be final. So like the compile times for those were.
Oh shit!
Even the smallest Earthbound levels could take at minimum 4 hours to
that's
get
crazy.
But the Zen levels, that was like those 12 to 14, right? Chon, to get everything finally.
The Interloper Outdoor maps, I think we were getting 18 to 20 hour compile times.
Holy shit!
Memory because it's a 32-bit VRAD. So
you better make sure everything is right then, right?
Yeah, it's just like by the end of it, we were kind of like spinning the wheel, and something could pop up. But yeah, it's. Right. We have a love-hate relationship with the Source engine.
Yeah, did you guys have like a render farm or something?
Honestly, it was all on our local machines, and
right.
Our CPUs are feeling it. But
right. Yeah.
That's just the way it is, I guess. So.
Yeah, that's what they're made for.
We tried to use some servers to do compiles, and it wasn't really speeding things up at all.
Okay,
and it was quite expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even we do have the thread limit increase, but. I mean, who knows if the difference is even that negligible? But
well, anecdotally,
I heard like in Source 2, it's going to be even worse, though. Oh, sorry, what did you say?
I was going to say anecdotally, I just was on with a stream looking at one of the most recent Danger Zone Battle Royale maps for CSGO. And that community one apparently takes about 12 hours to compile, and it's probably around the same size, I would imagine, as some of the Black Mesa stuff. So even after the multi-threading, I don't think it would have made that much of a difference, unfortunately. I mean, in a way, it's almost like, it would suck. It would feel bittersweet if you guys move on to Unreal as Source gets a bunch of updates that makes it much better. Because then it's like
Source 2. I mean, in the back of our heads, we're wondering if that would be an option. But from what I understand, it's still going to be internal for a bit there. I've dabbled around in Source 2, and it's definitely appealing, especially the trimming stuff they've been able to do in Alex. It's stuff I wish I could dive into on a real project, but anything beyond Source 1 at this point, I will gladly accept. So I think there's that beautiful balance of love-hate on the Source engine, where it's like the novelty of being able to pull something off in such tight circumstances. Like it's fun in a way, and it's like solving a puzzle, but pragmatically as a game development thing, it doesn't work out too much. So that was definitely a hard part of transitioning as game dev as a hobby into game dev full-time, was the time constraints. So Source it won't allow for that anymore, unfortunately.
Cool.
How are you guys feeling about Unreal so far as a comparison? Are you guys using Unreal 4 specifically?
Yeah.
Okay. How is that as coming from? Are you a refugee? Are you like recovering from Stockholm syndrome?
I said, at least I worked in UE4 on Tar Unite before I came back to Black Mesa. So I actually worked on Gmod Tower, moved to Unreal, moved back to Source, and now I'm going back into UE4 again. So that's been a fun juggle. But I think Chon's warming up to UE4 for sure. He has some anecdotes, I'm sure.
So it's great, basically. The biggest challenge that I think the level designers faced is we've moved from, when you build BSP, you can just drag the corners and it's very easy to make base blockouts. But at least on UE4, because we're doing everything mesh based, we're using pivots like a model would, and it doesn't sound like a big difference, but it really changes the way you work with the pieces and move them around a lot. So that's probably the biggest obstacle I think we face so far. Otherwise, everything else is just so much easier, so much quicker, so much simpler. And even just being able to see the damn lighting in the editor is such a huge difference.
Yeah.
I still don't know how our lighting artists did it for Zen, because they were just like, I mean, we do have our dynamic light system has a real-time editor in game, but all the static lighting and stuff, like it's just shots in the dark from their mental knowledge base of what they think looks good. And every time I'm blown away by what they can pull off. So I'm excited for them to apply that in a real-time, setting, because that'll just speed up the process and enable a lot more stuff. So
cool. Is there anything you can share about the new game you're working on, or nothing?
Other than it's an Unreal.
Okay.
It's high wraps right now for sure. But
cool. Nice.
Soon.
It's also an original piece of work, so it's not
remake.
like a Half-Life remake or anything.
Nothing in that.
That must be super exciting for you guys as well.
Yeah, thank you. We're excited with what we're cooking.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, I actually have a couple of questions, and we can answer these in sort of ephemeral, around the beating around the bush ways, so that you guys don't have to worry about leaking any info. But like, how has the process been now that you're essentially you've almost primed yourselves for working on something totally original by doing the Zen stuff, where it was a step removed from a faithful recreation, and now you guys are able to go into the environment where, I mean, it's a double-edged sword from my personal experience, going from modding or making something out of somebody else's IP to suddenly having your very own responsibility to make everything yourself. And so I'm curious as to how that's been on your guys's, like, in terms of the change that has had to happen for your creative processes to turn that into a new pipeline, basically. And I guess this is a question pretty much for anybody involved on the team, but like,
I would
go ahead.
The only thing I'd mention is, it's not a secret that we're leveraging content packs just initially to get things out the gate.
Of course,
that's something that PUBG did with their weapons, and now they have their own assets. And it's just, with the expectation of how fast we need to be moving, it's, bring in those external assets. But, we're still focusing on the hero assets that we need to put time and attention into, at least. But I think UE4 kind of, it helps us out in that aspect that, we're not focusing on every individual aspect anymore. And we're no longer placing individual blades of grass like we were in Hammer. We're thinking about like painting larger swaths and, making white lists and doing things procedurally with blueprints. And like, I think that's the framework that's going to open up the level design's minds out of this, kind of box they were constrained into, for sure. So.
And I think to expand on what Pronogo said, is basically we're really lucky. Our experience working on Black Mesa Zen basically put us exactly in the middle of the skills you need to pick up and the kind of having a lead into it. So we had the luxury of having this incredible Half-Life community behind us and supporting us and buying our product and giving us feedback on it, and the kind of whole learning process of trying to build something original within that incredible framework that Valve had already laid down. So we've managed to assemble quite a talented team off the back of this and learn a lot of the design principles necessary for original work. So at least from my perspective, because I'm handling the design end of things, it's been wonderful. It's really just great that we've been able to. We're luckier than the vast majority of dev teams, I would say, because a lot of dev teams, they have to come together from nothing and take their stab in the dark, and that's kind of their shot. Whereas we've been very lucky to have this kind of transition into it, and we're hoping to make the most of that by building a really cool game that everyone loves.
But of course, there's also more pressure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Chon does have a fair point about, we could talk technical stuff and the advantages of that, but I think in the last year alone, just our organizational skills using like Trello and just communicating with people, and we've completely evolved in terms of how we operate at Crowbar.
Because you guys are worldwide, right? You're all over the world.
Yeah. So cool. Chon's in the UK. Shawn and I are about, and 4 hours away from each other, I think, with driving. We had people in California. Kim is, he's Swedish, but he lived in Australia for a while there. So it's just, Discord.
Was someone in Vietnam or Thailand, right? Or?
I lived in Thailand.
Oh, that was you. Okay, yeah. So how do you do this with meetings? Is it like someone has to wake up in the middle of the night?
Chon did a lot of sacrificing, for sure.
Oh, really? Yeah, just like partying and then just like go all the night through until the meeting.
I did quite a few 3 a.m. meetings while I was there. Chetan's in India, for example. He's our lead programmer, and he does 1 a.m. meetings, I think.
Right. Yeah.
It's not easy, but it's got its own massive advantages as well. So,
yes, of course. Like working from home is great. I like it as well.
our lead Adam lives in Syracuse, so he's kind of like the anchor for our time zones. So
All right. Cool.
that. I mean, we're making it work, I think.
Nice. Yeah.
And if I have to switch to 3 a.m. meetings to balance it out, so be it. And I love what I do. So
yeah, it's worth all the pros that
absolutely
come with it. Yeah,
Absolutely.
Understand.
In a way, this team got to. Unfortunately, I'm not really involved in the new game. I've got other stuff that's taking all my time now. I'm hoping that I will always get to be connected with the Crowbar Collective for the rest of my life. But so I'm not actively involved with the new game. But what I was going to say is this team actually got to practice whatever the rest of the world had to get pushed into this last year,
Yes.
right? So we were already prepared for this. Which is kind of a useful thing to realize that maybe beforehand some of the guys may have felt like, man, I'd rather be in a place somewhere. But in reality, everyone got to be learning practical tools and working remotely and collaboratively, and I think everyone will benefit of that for the rest of their lives. Honestly,
I can relate to that for sure. Yeah, I think coming out of high school, my idea of game development was definitely anchoring myself in that studio and establishing. But I kind of walked out of high school and I started working on games and contracting art. And initially, it wasn't my end goal, but it has inadvertently turned up that way. And it turns out the process along the way, I realized that it might be a better way to operate than within an actual physical studio. Because I mean, these big budget games, like they've got satellites communicating with each other across the country as it is. So I think this was inevitable in a sense. So as Shawn said, like a couple of years ago, like not coming out of my apartment, I was like, oh man, I need to get out more. But now I'm in here, and it's like I couldn't be more thankful of the situation that we're in right now. It's really a blessing, to be honest. So
you never ever have been into a traffic jam for work? If you got out of college straight into
I definitely put a lot of I sacrificed a lot, including my grades in high school. I kind of just came home and worked on mods instead. And I started modding. Right. And that's
good parents.
Yeah, my parents, I was met with a lot of pushback, but I think they understand now that what I was going for. So
cool.
we're in a point in time where like I'm standing on the shoulder of giants, with Substance Painter and the improvements to Max and Shawn alone. The tools that he provided me is what enabled me to create these things. So I couldn't have done it alone by any standard. But if you're young and you're getting into it, it's to the point where you have access to everything you need to get started. And I kind of just tried to cast my net on everything as wide as I can. I guess modeling is where I landed, and it definitely spoke to me in that sense. So yeah, it was definitely interesting to. I mean, I did go back to community college and take classes in the meantime, and those were transformative in sense of my compositional skills and things like that. But technically, like you can just go on YouTube, and as long as you're finding the right person with the right methodology, I've picked up habits from. The world of level design taught me everything I know about Hammer. So call up Alex, and he's doing UE4 stuff now, and I've been watching his videos for that. I can't thank Alex enough for his tutorials that he's been putting
really good website as well.
I started watching him in like 2008 when I was in middle school, in Hammer. So
probably also Tweakalix Philip videos.
Yeah, Philip is
top hat waffle.
They're so Top Hat and everybody. They know how to communicate those ideas so well, and I can't thank him enough for getting to that position for me. So it's been a wild 10 years, at least for me. I don't know about Chon, because you also did your modding in your spare time, and that kind of came up for you as well. So
my story pretty much mirrors yours, just a couple of years in advance, really. I also sacrificed university grades at the altar of making source mods, and then also left straight into working on Black Mesa. And again, it has Matt. I think you pretty much just summed it up. I don't really have anything to add. I feel pretty much the exact same way as you.
We're just really
lucky to be a part of this.
Yeah.
What about you, Warworm Shawn? What about you doing right now? Because of course I know you work at Autodesk right now, but maybe you also want to talk a little bit about your own projects, or are you working on something particular?
Well, I'm working at Autodesk now as a product owner for 3ds Max. So it's really like a dream come true for me. What I get to do, work with some of the world's greatest geniuses. It's unbelievable the guys that I get to be surrounded with right now, guys and girls. But I'm not sure exactly what to say. I don't want to sit here and blah 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 forever. Other than I'm working at Autodesk now.
Right.
I got a bit of a
It's
segue.
still pretty exciting, right? Like you may make it sound like it's as if it's like just a company, but
Amazing. It's well, right now I'm working on what's called world building, overseeing world building in 3ds Max. So building some new tools that's really up the alley of what Chon and Matt here would actually be really excited about if they weren't just doing Unreal stuff right now, but just building expansive environments in Max and building out tools to facilitate doing procedural world building in a fun and fast way. I mean, and
right, yeah.
Being able to get involved building tools to do that kind of stuff is just super exciting,
Yeah, you showed me some cool stuff as well, like with the forest and everything on the hill.
Yeah.
But also, like, you guys are working out like on a game in Unreal Engine, but you're not using 3D Max anymore, or?
I still am for my work.
Right.
I think we for a while tried to get level design to come into the Max workflow for Wallworm and getting that in. It's just the knowledge was so rooted for them that it would probably have taken more time to get them antiquated with Max and designing in that than it would have just to play out Black Mesa. And so now the rug's being pulled out from them with Hammer, and we're going to see where it lands. But I think there's a lot of value in 3ds Max for level design for sure, and I think we can start to leverage that in the future, hopefully, as we get antiquated with this new tool set. So right now we're just using Supergrid for blocking stuff out and keeping it really basic. But I'm supplementing little pieces that an LD might need for a block out, or just trims and stuff like that. So
cool.
What I wanted to ask about next is a sort of I guess we're drawing towards the end of the 2-hour block here. One of the things I wanted to talk about as we're coming to a close is obviously you guys actually alluded to this earlier when you talked about that there are 2 different teams working on versions of the expansion packs to Half-Life 1, and essentially maybe even making them in similar style to Black Mesa. Of course, I was talking with Cat Food about this earlier before we even went live, but Project Borealis is an Unreal Engine 4 version of essentially what's meant to be Half-Life 3, and that's like another example of a community project that's trying to come in and take to the space. And given that you guys have actually released a now finished product with the same sort of goal of being this community project made by the fans for the fans to some extent, I'm curious as if you have any sort of advice or some words of wisdom to share for the people who are going their own ways, either sticking with Source or going into Unreal, but essentially trying to make that same sort of community project in a similar style to what I view Black Mesa as.
Chon, do you have anything?
I have one piece
the
of
only
advice.
thing I would say is that, like, once you know Source and its quirks, like those are kind of like the building blocks to why it's improved. So I think because of the exposure to Source you had, like, it kind of keeps your brain a little more open to newer concepts and stuff like that, because you've already experienced the worst. So it only gets better from here. Good job. You did the hard work already. So go ahead, Shawn. Sorry.
I was just going to say that I encourage people to not get trapped in just assuming that there's some kind of way of doing something. So explore new ways of solutions, because I think that game design and all digital design over the last 30 years, it's been like an evolving work in progress. So a lot of times you hear the word like, this is standards, or this is how it's done, or all that kind of stuff. And the reality is it's all being made up as it goes along anyway. So if someone says this is how it's done, it might be valuable to learn from it, but it may not be valuable to automatically stick to something just because some other people are saying this is how you do something. So I would say learn from everything, but try to find your own ways of solving things and be creative about it, because the process of solving problems actually helps you become a better artist and a better person all around anyway. So that's really my main input.
Yeah, and there's also this chance that by accident you come across other things that are like super useful.
Yeah.
That if you just learned like one thing, right, and then you stick to that and not try other things,
Yeah.
you miss out on all those opportunities as well. So
I remember
agree
my
with you. Yeah. Sorry?
first year of Black Mesa, like I'd call Shawn up on Discord and I'd be like, man, I've spent hours doing this thing. Like, what's going on? And then Shawn would just be like, well, there's this feature that,
Yeah, it sounds so familiar.
So I'm like, crap. I cannot believe I just wasted that much time. But just those small revelations that built up. Yeah, Shawn was always there to show me a new feature in Max that was tucked away that I just, I learn a new thing every day when Shawn is within distance of me for knowledge. So
yeah, sounds familiar. Yeah.
Did you have anything to share there, Chon, about your take on this sort of topic of trying to build a community project, maybe as a stepping stone for something in the future?
Well, I think Shawn already put it very well. But if I could generalize his point a little bit, I would just say, as with a lot of things in life, it's just about a balance, really. You have to have confidence in your vision. You have to be able to stick to your guns and do what you think is right and make the game. But you also have to be humble about it. You have to listen to what other people have to say about it. You have to be able to think about when you might be wrong about something, when something might not be as fun as it should be, when it might not look as good as it should be, when, as Shawn said, you haven't done things in necessarily the best way. You have to also have the ability to say, no, okay, we're going to change this, or we're going to try and take this in this direction without losing your confidence, because you have to be able to confidently take things in a direction. Otherwise, you're just constantly grasping around trying to satisfy everyone.
Yeah.
So that was one of the things we really had to try and do with Black Mesa. And again, you're never going to please everyone.
Yes. Yeah.
You have to know where to draw the line, where it's good to take feedback and do something a different way, or whether it's good to say, no, we're keeping it like this. And I think that's true for all forms of game development and pretty much all forms of art anyway. So yeah, I would just say it's just about the balance.
Yeah.
Good advice.
All right. Well, I'm not sure if anybody has any final thoughts, or Kafud, if you have any sort of wrap up final questions, but I think it's we've covered a lot.
Yeah, we covered a lot. Yeah, for sure. No. I already asked my opposing force blue shift. It's not going to happen. Yeah. So
I believe Tripmine Studios is one of the people that are working on a remake.
Okay. So okay.
At least they've been posting stuff on YouTube recently. I like what they're seeing.
Well, this is going to be the same quality as Black Mesa.
I'm not to say necessarily, but I like what I see. I think
I'll keep an eye on it. Thanks. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Cool.
See you guys.
Thanks for watching.
Bye, everyone.